there's at this stage.
What's the difference between Syria, the situation in Syria and the situation in Ukraine?
There's no U.S. armed forces inside of Syria.
And then they'd say he left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil.
There's no U.S. armed forces inside of Syria.
More and more countries in the global south have been speaking out and criticizing so-called multilateral organizations, exposing them for their bias in the interest of Western governments. And this March, we saw a clear example of this, in which the United Nations lied, falsely claiming that the US military is not occupying Syrian territory. This happened at a UN press conference on March 24th, in which the deputy spokesman for the UN Secretary General, his name is Farhan Haq, he was asked by the Chinese journalist Edward Chu if the US military is occupying Syria. The UN spokesman said, "There is no US armed forces inside of Syria. There is no ground presence." This is a complete lie. This journalist, Edward Chu, pointed out the hypocrisy of the United Nations, which has condemned Russia for violating the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, but hasn't said anything condemning the United States for over 8 years now violating the territorial sovereignty of Syria and illegally occupying Syria's oil fields.
Couple of questions on Syria. Yesterday, there's a drone attack to a U.S. base in northeast Syria, which resulted in one death and 6 injured. After that, U.S. launched a airstrike, also killed 11 people in Syria. Any reaction from the Secretary General on this incident?
Oh, well, of course, we continue to be worried about all of the continuing tensions, and we are trying to see what can be done to lower the tensions from different forces in Syria, and we'll continue with those efforts.
Do you not to urge everybody to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria?
Well, of course, that's a given, and obviously it's important that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria is respected. At the same time, you're aware of the complexity of the situation of foreign forces, but we call for them to exercise restraint.
But do you think the presence of the U.S. military in Syria is illegal or not?
That's not an issue that we're dealing with at this stage. There's been a war.
But is that because it sounds very familiar. This week we talk a lot about the UN Charter, the international law, and relative resolutions. But it sounds to me a foreign presence, foreign military-based presence in another country without invitation sounds like something else to me. You know.
I'll leave your analysis to you. There's at this stage.
What's the difference between Syria, the situation in Syria, and the situation in Ukraine?
There's no U.S. armed forces inside of Syria, and so I don't have a. It's not a parallel situation.
You're
to some of the
sure
others.
there's no U.S. military personnel?
I believe there's military activity.
Yeah.
But in terms of ground presence in Syria, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, 5 U.S. service members were injured in that attack. If there were no U.S. service members in Syria, how could they got injured? That's weird, right? Should I ask you about that?
In reality, the US military has been illegally occupying Syrian territory since 2015. This shows video footage of US troops in Syrian territory where the oil wells are, and the US military is illegally occupying them in collaboration with Kurdish separatist groups in Syria. And this footage is published by Kurdistan 24. The government of Syria, which is recognized by the United Nations, does not approve of the U.S. military occupation and has repeatedly called for the U.S. troops to leave, and yet they refuse to leave. This explains why this March there was a drone attack on a U.S. base with U.S. soldiers and a military contractor was killed. And this has led to several mainstream media outlets acknowledge the U.S. military occupation of Syria, although always with elements of propaganda in their reporting. The Associated Press admitted that American troops have been in Syria since 2015, and they admit that the U.S. military claims that supposedly the troops are there to fight the remnants of ISIS, which was defeated years ago. But the AP admits that in reality, Iran is another reason the U.S. remains in Syria. And they write, Tehran's political influence and militia strength throughout the region have created a security concern for the U.S. So this is acknowledging that the U.S. is illegally occupying Syrian sovereign territory as part of its hybrid war on Iran, seeking to weaken Iran. In another article that was published in the New York Times in early March before the drone attack on the U.S. base, they admitted that the U.S. still has hundreds of troops that are illegally occupying Syria. I read, quote, America still has more than 900 troops and hundreds more contractors in Syria. So it is an objective fact that, again, the UN is lying about. Now, well, Western corporate media outlets claim, misleadingly, that U.S. troops have to occupy Syria in order to fight the remnants of ISIS or contain Iran. Former U.S. President Donald Trump also let the cat out of the bag and admitted that another significant reason that the U.S. is occupying Syria is to steal its oil. Trump said this dozens of times. He made it as clear as humanly possible. Here's a video clip that he did here's an interview he did in Fox News, where he just boasts that the U.S. is stealing Syria's oil.
And then they say he left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil. They're protecting the oil. I took over.
We're taking
the oil.
We're not taking the oil.
Well, maybe we will. Maybe we won't.
They're protecting the facility.
I don't know. Maybe we should take it. But we have the oil. Right now, the United States has the oil. So they say he left troops in Syria. No, I got rid of all of them other than we're protecting the oil. We have the oil.
So that was Trump saying again and again and again that the U.S. is taking Syria's oil. And this has also been acknowledged by mainstream media outlets like the Washington Post. They have a neoconservative pro-war columnist named Josh Rogin. And in 2018, he admitted, in Syria, we took the oil. And his article notes that the U.S. controls 30% of Syrian territory, which is around where 90% of the pre-war oil production took place, referring to this as leverage. So this is the U.S. stealing Syria's oil to prevent the government from rebuilding. This was also admitted in 2020 in an article in U.S. state media NPR, which said very clearly that the U.S. forces in northeastern Syria have a new mission, securing oil fields, not only from ISIS, but also from the Syrian government and Russian forces. NPR quotes a so-called embedded reporter, Tom Bowman, and it notes that he's traveling with American military forces. So this is a so-called journalist who's a propagandist who's literally embedded with the U.S. military. And he admitted, he said that Trump kept 600 U.S. troops to secure these oil fields, not only from ISIS, but also from Syrian government and Russian forces. Now, the U.S. wants their Kurdish forces, their allies, their proxies, to use the proceeds from the oil to pay for U.S. operations. So this is the U.S. This is an embedded reporter working with the U.S. military at U.S. state media outlet NPR, admitting that the U.S. is stealing Syria's oil and using it to pay for its own military occupation of Syria. Now, finally, the most blatant example of this, it's just a disgusting example of a U.S. government official admitting that Washington is occupying Syrian territory and stealing its oil, is a video clip from Dana Stroul, who was the official who oversaw the U.S. Congress's Syria study group, and then the Biden administration promoted her, and she is now the head of the Middle East desk at the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. She's a neoconservative warmonger, and in this panel discussion in 2019 at the neoconservative U.S. government-funded think tank in Washington, CSIS, which is, another neoconservative warmongering group in D.C., she boasted that the U.S. military owns 1/3 of Syrian territory. That's how she put it, that the U.S. owns this Syrian territory, which includes Syria's oil and wheat. And then she boasted that Washington is using it as leverage to prevent Syria from rebuilding houses, rebuilding its country after a decade of a U.S.-fueled proxy war.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime, so holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
So that is the reality, the dirty reality of the U.S. military having this neo-colonial occupation of Syria. And yet the United Nations, the spokesman for the Portuguese Secretary General, who's very biased in the interest of Western governments, he claims falsely that the U.S. military is not occupying Syria. So once again, the West has one set of standards for themselves and another set of standards for the rest of the world. They condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but never say a word condemning the U.S. military occupation of Syria or the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which this March is the 20th anniversary, that led to 1 million Iraqis losing their lives, more than 1 million deaths, and not a word of criticism. This is the reality of the so-called rules-based order set up by the Western colonial powers. And unfortunately, the United Nations has shown that it is also a handmaiden to this very unjust, biased order. And fortunately, there are a few journalists who are willing to call them out, like that Chinese journalist, Edward Xu, who deserves credit. With that said, I'm going to conclude